In 1945, the world would enter the nuclear age as the first free atomic bombs were created. The bombs were an existential representation of the greatest competition between the world's two biggest superpowers. And in the midst of that, two men from one of these superpowers essentially had the entire world's power within their hands and did not realize how big and how monumental the events they would translate would be in. Stanley Petrov and Vasily Arkhipov, two men who had all the power in the world at the wrong point of time. Humanity is no stranger to destruction. We beat each other up with sticks and stones. We throw sticks and stones to each other. We eventually were able to create shields. We create bow and arrows. We create swords. We create guns. We create explosives. And the weapons would only get much more deadlier from there. By 1896, Baverdi Epsero unintentionally discovered radiation by putting a uranium isotope onto a photographic plate, unintentionally finding the chemical properties of radiation. Scientists would later use this to help discover nuclear technology and eventually the nuclear bombs. By 1939, the Manhattan Project began, which successfully created the first free atomic bombs, Trinity, Little Boy, and Fat Man. Trinity being the very first nuclear bomb to be ever detonated. And by 1945, Little Boy and Fat Man would be used to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, making it the first two nuclear bombs, to ever be used in war. After the war, the world would see two superpowers, the capitalist Protestant America and the communist atheist Russia. The extreme powers between both sides created technology much more rival and against each other and would eventually lead up to the space race. And with both of them being nuclear powers, this would eventually create the intercontinental ballistic missile. And those missiles would be capable of detonating nuclear bombs against each nation. And eventually, the combination of these bombs would lead to the worst tension between the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the CIA conducted a raid against Cuba, believing that the Soviets sent nuclear missiles into the small island nations to be aimed at the United States. The Bay of Pigs, which so the raid was called, was a tremendous failure, as the CIA only sent a handful of soldiers and a handful of weapons, and more or less used the opportunity to create civil war inside Cuba. But eventually this would lead to a much bigger threat 1 year later, when tensions reached so high that the United States had blockaded the entire eastern portion of the Caribbean, preventing the Soviet Union from entering missiles into the country, leading to a long standoff known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Between the crisis, one such man, a high-ranking officer within a Soviet submarine, was stationed right outside the eastern coast of Florida, was the very first person and unintentionally created a mass amount of power that would inevitably created World War III. That man was Vasily Arkhipov. Him and two other high-ranking officers were in a submarine off the coast of Florida, where they come across two underwater mines within the area, and the United States Navy was warning the submarine to surface. Unfortunately, the leaders within the submarine thought it was an act of war against each other, and the submarine, unfortunately, was carrying nuclear missiles within its arsenal, being the only weapons they had. Unable for the submarine to actually launch the missiles, all 3 commanding officers must agree on releasing them, and only 2 out of the 3 officers agreed to fire the missiles. The officer that did not agree was Arkhipov. Instead, he decided to stay put within the area and not surface at all, but yet not attack the Americans. His decision had fortunately made sure that our world was not, that our country, if not our whole world, was not in a nuclear crisis. The war never started, and we were not in an age of a nuclear wasteland. His decision unintentionally saved the lives of billions of people at his time, and he did not even realize it. Long past the Cuban Missile Crisis, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union would begin to decrease over time. Even some fair shares and peaceful negotiations have been made in between the 60s to the 80s. But all that would change once Ronald Reagan would enter the office, the U.S. presidential office, in 1980, in a tragic incident in 1983 where Korean airline 007 was shot down by the Soviet Army, and all 269 passengers, including Senator Larry McDonald, were all killed in the incident. This would eventually lead to another incident that is way less known to us today, but you could argue would have been our Judgment Day back at this time. On September 26, 1983, the day was mostly uneventful for the most part. Children went to school and the adults went to work. However, in a Soviet military base that had nuclear missiles in Western Russia, a mysterious alarm came off warning that 5 nuclear missiles was heading to the Soviet Union. And at this base is where Stanley Petrov was at. And unlike in the United States, where we have a series of checks and balances that prevent both the Senate and the President from launching nuclear missiles, at this specific base in the Soviet Union, there was no such checks and balances. If an attack was going to happen, Stanley Petrov was the one there who can tell them to retaliate with their missiles, and they would unintentionally create World War III, an age of radiation and a nuclear wasteland between our entire world. So at this point in time, Stan Petrov unintentionally had all the power in the world in the midst of his hands for a very brief moment in time. So what did he do within this extremely stressful moment in his life? He determined that the missile warning was a glitch within their computer system, and it was confirmed to just be a glitch. His sudden decision, critical thinking decision, at this very moment in time, saved the entire world from an unintentional nuclear attack between each of the nations. These 2 men in history, Arkhipov and Petrov, unintentionally saved the whole world, and they never even realized it, nor their names would have never been said and be mentioned ever again. In 1996, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened, which the entire city and the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl would catastrophically fail and a nuclear meltdown would happen, nearly destroying most of Eastern Europe and essentially pursuing the entire world's public and making nuclear technology very negative between the worlds. By this point, denuclearization between both the superpowers would begin. By 1991, the Soviet Union would dissolve completely and eventually form the Russian Federation and a series of brand new nations within the process. It doesn't necessarily mean that the the Cold War had necessarily ended, but the persistence of the events Israel propaganda and the uneasing tensions would eventually dissolve not in so much a nation versus nation within a self-civil conflict. And in this time right now, we have seen such conflicts unintentionally create the coronavirus disaster, proving in some ways that humanity is somewhat doomed to basically self-destruct on themselves. And while it's obviously not a nuclear disaster, in fact it's a lot more better than a nuclear disaster, we can at least agree that we are not living in an apocalyptic event, and two men within history, Stanley Petrov and Vasily Arkhipov, unintentionally saved our world from such an even worse threat of nuclear annihilation. In the end, their names would not be remembered too often, but we can at least be thankful that in such a critical time in human history, their critical thinking actually helped save our lives.